So I'm assuming that everyone read the article, The Soul Quality of Saints, which was a general article, number one, on how spirituality gets reflected, in the birth chart and some of the key factors for seeing that, for assessing that. But in particular, this idea that using the Jaimini Atmakaraka, the planet with the highest degrees in the chart, exclusive of Rahu and Ketu, per the one Jaimini Sutra that I quoted, some soul quality of the individual can be assessed, and we saw in the charts that I utilized of great spiritual luminaries how so often their Atmakaraka was in a special condition and in houses related to spirituality specifically, oftentimes well associated, so on and so forth. So we'll continue along that vein, but there's going to be some new wrinkles that I'll be talking about related to that. You're seeing before you now the chart of what I would consider one of the greatest popes of the modern era, the Catholic Pope, leader of the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II, who actually, his tenure as Pope, his reign as Pope, was one of the longest in history, and he brought about many reforms within the Church. He was also very unique in that he was the first Polish Pope, the first individual from Poland who ever became the Pope. And one of the reasons I wanted to show his chart is, if you recall from the article, I was using the chart of the famous Catholic stigmatist, Padre Pio. And when this priest, when this Pope was a very young priest, as I talked about in the article, he made a pilgrimage to visit with Padre Pio and was stunned when Padre Pio told him that his destiny was to become Pope, which of course came true. So we see now his before us. And hello, it sounds like we've been joined by Girish.
Yeah.
You see the chart before you here. And again, this person was a religious figure. He was the Pope of the Catholic Church, had a spiritual head to millions upon millions. What strikes you about his chart from that standpoint? Anything leap out at you?
His Atmakaraka is in Moksha house, in 12th house.
So Lena, zeroes in on was most about, which is the fact that his planet with the highest degrees, in this case, is Mars at 2941 of Virgo, and it's also in the 12th house. And if you recall,
and his Sun and Moon also in Moksha house, in 8th house, Sun and Moon.
Right. Okay. So, and by the way, when I pose questions, panelists should maybe give everybody a chance to sort of consider it themselves before they jump in. Please don't answer too quickly. I want everyone
I'm sorry.
to be. No, it's okay, Lena. It's all right. And have everybody reflect on this. But so we saw over and over again how in the charts I was showing in the article, very often we had an Atmakaraka falling in the 12th, falling in the 9th, either it was exalted or its own sign, or very, very often it was in the condition of being Vargotama, which Atmakaraka. Else that strikes you as being giving a source of strength or making it special in some way? Anybody see anything else that could indicate and foster that?
Can I say something? Jupiter is the Karaka for spirituality and for being a priest and preaching and a guru. His Jupiter in exalted, and the dispositor of this Jupiter moon is also exalted.
Yes, this is a very, very relevant point, Ekaterina. Obviously, if someone's going to be a major religious figure, very often we see a very strong Jupiter. They pointed out it's in the 10th house, in its exaltation sign, but she brings up a very important and relevant point that I want to make with regards to planets in their exaltation sign. The first thing I look for when I see a planet in its exaltation sign is, first of all, how close in degrees is it to its highest point of exaltation, which it's not that close here. Does anybody remember what the highest degree of exaltation for Jupiter is? Anybody remember that?
Jay is saying 5 degrees.
5 degrees. Good for him. 5 degrees. So it's not that close here, but one of the things you really need to look at is the dispositor. Right? There's a world of difference between an exalted planet whose dispositor is, as in this case, likewise exalted. You see the moon in Taurus, and a exalted planet whose dispositor is, say, in its debilitation sign. And so this is a very relevant point that Ekaterina made. And he became a cardinal in the major period of Jupiter and the sub-period of the moon. So the cardinal is a very, very high position within the Catholic Church. It's the next highest after actually being Pope. So yes, this combination in this chart both indicates his destiny for being a religious figure, a religious leader, but then of a very, very high status. So, but coming back to the Mars, Atmakaraka that Lena immediately identified, anything else strike you about it that might be, give it an added quality? Hmm?
Jay, I see you have a good point. You are unmuted. Can you please speak up?
I think Mars is aspecting its moon Trikona sign.
Mars does aspect on its own sign, which of course, we understand that when Mars aspects, or when any planet aspects on its sign, that helps boost up the quality of what that result can be. Anybody see anything happening here between Mercury and Mars? Mm-hmm.
Exchange.
They're in an exchange, right? So what I wanted people to see is that his Atmakaraka Mars is not only Vargotama in the 12th, but it's also in an exchange with its dispositor, which, as you've seen over and over again in my article, I emphasize as a point of being able to create a condition where that planet has a strong source of strength. But then, when we see the Atmakaraka planet, and I think I brought this out in the article, we all see it, in which case, what do we notice then?
Same thing happens in the Vamsha.
It is again involved in exchange. Good for you, Jay. Different kind of exchange this time, right? But then look at its associations. Now, I guess I know a lot of people here maybe have not had much exposure to the Jaimini system, but in the article I was explaining that in the Jaimini system, when we look at the influence on planets, we're actually looking at what's called Rashi Drishti, or sign aspects. The easiest ones to see are between, planets in the dual Rashis, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, in which case they'll all influence each other. In which case, what do we notice here? What do we see about this? In the Vamsha.
Mars is aspecting both Jupiter and Moon.
Well, we're looking exactly. We're looking at the additional influences on the Atmakaraka in the Vamsha, in which case it's getting the influence of and a Swakshetra Jupiter, a Jupiter in its own sign. So note now that his Jupiter is exalted in the birth chart, but then also has great underlying strength in the Navamsha as well, where it's in its own sign. And in the Navamsha, the Atmakaraka gets the additional aspect of Jupiter. Right? So what other features of this chart strike you at all in terms of yogas? why we're looking at this chart. And you know what? I'm going to put a table up here that gives us karakas so people can see that as well. Because there was another karaka that I was emphasizing, right? But we'll leave that for a moment. Getting back to my question, any yogas here stand out to people?
Yes, Girish.
Yeah, I see Srinatha Yoga, the ninth lord, Venus and Mercury in the 7th house.
Wonderful. So one of the yogas, I spoke about 3 yogas given in Paladipika, that medieval text of Jyotish, that can incline a person towards spirituality in the context of a spiritually oriented chart, which we certainly have here. Girish, could you talk about what the definition of Srinatha Yoga is?
Yeah, it's in an angle or a trine together with Venus and Mercury, either in an angle or a trine.
Okay, so what has to happen here is that Venus, Mercury, and the 9th Lord have to be either in angles or trines. And of course, since Mercury is the 9th Lord here, Srinatha Yoga applies here. What makes this a particularly strong Srinatha Yoga? Because, when we see yogas, we always have to qualify them. Part of that qualification is strength of planets.
It's because it's together with the Mokshakaraka Ketu.
Well, certainly that contributes to, you may recall I was talking about the different ways in which Ketu gets spiritualized, right? And one of those ways is when it's either placed in the 5th or the 9th house or with the 5th and the 9th Lord, which is what we see here. But what I was saying is that, what makes this a particularly good Srinatha Yoga?
Hello, Mark. This is Chuck.
Yeah, Chuck, go ahead.
Hi. Is it the exchange you were talking about earlier with Mars and Mercury?
Well, yes, in the sense that this becomes a source of strength for Mercury. Right? What we're always looking at when we're looking at, the qualities of a yoga, first thing we're looking at, do the planets involved have any source of strength? And we saw that Mercury's involved in this exchange, both in the birth chart and in the Vamsha, and that becomes its source of strength. What about Venus?
It says in own sign in the Navamsa.
It's in own sign in the Vamsha. So the 3 components of the Srinatha Yoga, which would be Venus and Mercury plays a double role here because it's the 9th Lord, all have sources of strength, and they're placed in angle houses. So yes, good for you for identifying a yoga that was spoken about in the article. Now there's another yoga here, more of a sannyas yoga, right, that was mentioned in the article. Does anyone spot it?
We have Venkatramanji.
Because of course he was a sannyasi.
We have Venkatramanji who's saying it could be a Mahapurusha yoga with Jupiter.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Jupiter is involved in a Mahapurusha yoga, the Hamsa yoga variety, right? Where Jupiter is in its exaltation sign in an angle. And of course, he ran his Jupiter period, as I talked about. It's when he became a bishop and then an archbishop and then a cardinal. He was rising up within the ranks of the church. And certainly the Mahapurusha yoga here, caused by Hamsa yoga, is certainly a part of that. What I was looking for or asking about is specifically a sannyasa yoga. It's a Jaimini sannyasa yoga that I mentioned in the article and gave one example. Anyone see it? It doesn't look like we're getting any response, right, Arun?
Yes, Lena.
Saturn aspecting Venus, dispositor of Moon.
Well, you know, one of the things I mentioned that can incline a person towards sannyas, especially in the context of a very spiritual-oriented chart, is when the moon comes under the influence of Saturn, right?
Yes.
And so you see a very close aspect here between the moon at 9, almost 10 degrees of Taurus and Saturn at 12. That's point number one. But actually, that's not the sannyas yoga that I'm referring to. It doesn't sound like people can see it, so let me just articulate it. Do you recall when, I think I quoted the Jaimini Sutra, that when Venus is under the mutual influence, Jaimini influence, of Ketu and Saturn, which are the two planets of dispassion, two planets of vairagya, two planets of renunciation, then this is a sannyasa yoga, tapasvi yoga, as it's referred to. Someone who does tapas, it's referred to in the Jaimini Sutras. So now remember here we have to apply Jaimini aspects. Venus is obviously very, very connected to Ketu. They're within the same degree. And since movable rashis get aspected by planets in fixed rashis, Saturn from Leo is making a Jaimini Rashi Dristi sign aspect onto Venus and Ketu in the image. Does everyone see that? Okay. Questions about that?
There are no questions on the
Alright.
screen, Mark, so we'll keep moving.
Okay, all right. So now here's an interesting consideration. You'll see that the article that I send out tomorrow related to this subscription program is all about Dasha Lagna, the use of a Mahadasha Lord as a Lagna, and seeing the patterning from there in the context of what that planet also can give and show from either the birth chart or from the moon. Now, he became Pope in his Saturn major period, and the sub-period was actually Venus. But now think, before you kind of look at the idea of the sub-period, just focus in on Saturn, the potential it can give from three different perspectives. From the perspective of the birth lagna, from the perspective of the moon, but then also, you know, what it can give from the standpoint of Dasha Lagna and the patterning of a chart that gets created from Dasha Lagna. Starting first with the birth ascendant. How does Saturn elevate him to such a high position? Where he sits on, you know, they talk about the pontiff having sort of the seat of power within the church, or the throne, or they don't call it a throne, but you understand the idea of what I'm referring to.
Fourth Lord in the 11th house.
So first of all, what kind of planet is Saturn for Libra?
It's a Yogakaraka.
Of course, it's the Yogakaraka, right? It's also the fourth Lord. Being a Mahadasha Lord, you have to see which sign it's in. You also have to see which nakshatra it's in, right? What strikes you about Saturn in Leo in the nakshatra? Which nakshatra that it's in, anyway?
Ketu.
Ketu's nakshatra, but what's the name of the nakshatra?
I think it should be Magha Nakshatra.
Magha.
Magha. Magha, right? So think about this. Saturn, Lord of the fourth, in Leo, in Magha, right? But then now, whenever we have a very strong Chandra Lagna, we always have to interpret from Chandra Lagna, but particularly when there's a powerful Chandra Lagna, as is the case here. Well,
It's the 9th and 10th Lord sitting in the 4th house.
yes. Does everyone see that? Now it becomes the Yogakaraka, 9th and 10th Lord, in that 4th house of the Siddhamsa, right, the seat of the lion. Okay. So now I will make it easier for you by showing the chart as if Leo, the place of the Mahadasha Lord, as a Lagna. Right? Take a look at the chart from here. What strikes you?
Who's in the ascendant?
In terms of what we know that happened to this person during the Saturn-Venus period, what strikes you?
Yes, Lena?
Venus, 10th Lord, is a 9th Lord.
Yes.
Right?
The 10th Lord goes to the 9th. It was during this time that he became Pope. What else strikes you? Anything? And by the way, you know, in my articles I've emphasized the way in which planets that are in a strong Kendra relationship with each other exert a mutual influence referred to in Parashar Horrors as mutual co-workers. Note the angular relationship between Venus and Mercury and Jupiter, okay? and the closeness in degrees that they all are. Not an aspect, they're not missing an aspect, they're mutuals from each other. Right? Anything else strike you about the patterning of the chart from this lagna that would be significant in terms of putting a person into a very high ecclesiastic position?
The first word goes in the 10th, Sun. So this is Raja Yoga.
Yes, yes, Sun, you know, here goes into the 10th house from the Dasha Lagna, you know, Sun's always powerfully placed when it falls in the 10th. Well, the first point I want to make is that Saturn makes Raja Yoga from all three perspectives. It's the Yogakaraka planet from both the birth Lagna and from Chandra Lagna, and even from Dasha Lagna, it becomes the first, 7th Lord in the first, right? But then, from, as Ekaterina just pointed out, Lagna Lord goes to the 10th with an exalted moon, with an additional benefic. Okay? So, and look at the relationship between Saturn and Venus. It's 5-9, with Venus, of course, falling in the 9th house from Saturn. So if you're, you know, and this is what I'm bringing out in the article that you're about to receive, if you're using the Vimshottari Dasha in the most complex, you might say, or most advanced way, you're evaluating a Mahadasha Lord from all three of those perspectives, from birth Lagna, from the moon, and from Chandra Lagna. So before we leave this chart and go on to another, though, there is one fairly significant yoga in his chart that we've talked about over and over again in this article series that we've not really mentioned yet. That's a particular good quality of this yoga.
The Saraswati Yoga, Venus Mercury in angle with Jupiter.
Beautiful, Jay. That's it. Right? He has a Saraswati Yoga, and of course, you know, if you read about his history, he was, you know, very, you know, knowledge-oriented, you know, very well-educated. He authored a number of treatises, theological treatises, made major contributions to the Second Ecumenical Council, which brought about, you know, significant reform within the church. And so, yes. And again, so the Saraswati Yoga, planets involved, Venus and Mercury, were part of the Srinatha Yoga, you know, and so on and so forth. So, but the main point here is that, again, you know, I'm not saying necessarily that Pope John Paul II was a true realized saint, but, you know, he certainly was you know, his whole life was committed to spirituality and spiritual development. And we see the Atmakaraka, Bhagautama in an exchange in the 12th house and in the Vamsa with the additional aspect of a Swakshetra Jupiter. So questions about anything we've said thus far before we move on?
I think, Mark, we are ready to move on.
Okay. So I need to pull up another chart here, one moment. So I'm showing you the chart now of an individual, Swami Chinmayananda, who was a one of the main disciples of Swami Sivananda. Have people heard of him? Do people know him? Anyone? Arun, have you heard of him?
Yes, of course. He's from the, the yoga, the founder of the yoga school, Shivanand, Satyanand, and the team.
Right. So he has a very interesting history. You know, he was a part of the Free India independence movement, had become a journalist, and I think it was around 1947 or whatnot. He was going to Rishikesh, and he was going to actually, his intent was to write an article critical of the Hindu monks of the time. And one of the people that he was going to be interviewing was Swami Sivananda. And because the Lord moves in mysterious ways, of course, what happened is in the presence of this individual, his skepticism and doubt about him and so on completely went away, and he ended up becoming his disciple and being initiated into sannyas in 1949, just a couple years later, as a result of having met him. Talk a little more further though. He started out as a journalist, and he was someone who was a very prolific author, someone who I think had something like 90 publications, wrote extensively on Advaita Vedanta and related subjects. It's been a long time since some of you may have read the Astrology of Authorship, but what immediately stands out to you as being indications in his chart that would incline him towards authorship. Anyone?
So Mark, before we proceed, is the chart, is it showing from Saturn? Not from the ascendant?
I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, but thank you for pointing that out. I was still using Saturn as a Vashalagna. Here's the chart.
So let's go one by one. We'll start with Lena.
Okay.
Mars is Atmakaraka, Karakamsha Lagna is Pisces, and Jupiter is in Pisces, Moon is in 5th house from Pisces, authorship.
So again, Lena immediately zeroed in on the main thrust of the article, which was the condition of the Atmakaraka in the charts of great spiritual luminaries. And here we see a little bit of a twist in the sense that it's Mars in this case, and it's consistent with what we saw, especially, for example, in the chart of Ramana Maharishi, where it's going to the 9th house, and it's with Ketu. It's also with the 9th Lord in its own sign, but it's in its debilitation sign, right? But what?
Well, it's with its own, it's with its dispositor.
It's with its dispositor, right? Which sort of changes that indication dramatically as we go again. And then, as Lena pointed out, it goes to Pisces, of course, in the function. I think that's a part of the article I was talking about the Yoga Sutra that, when the Atmakaraka goes to Meena, or Rashi, to Pisces, it actually could indicate moksha. It won't do that just by itself, but it certainly contributes to an individual having a deep spiritual promise within their chart, if it's within the context of a spiritually oriented chart in general. So here we see it in going into Pisces, but also with Jupiter. Gets the additional influence of another natural benefic Venus, but also Rahu and Saturn, as can see now. Rahu Ketu action. But before we started talking about how the spirituality is reflected in the chart, I wanted to come back to this idea of that he started out with an inclination of wanting to be a journalist, wanting to be a writer, and ended up publishing and writing so much in his life. What indications in his chart?
I'm sorry. I think I just pointed. Maybe it was misunderstanding. I was trying to say that from his Karakamsha. Jupiter is in his Karakamsha, and Moon is in 5th house. What? Maybe I'm wrong. I remember wrong, but Jaimini is pointing Moon, Jupiter, and Karakamsha 1st or 5th house make Moon and Jupiter makes one to be outer.
Actually, you're not wrong at all, Lena, and I'm very gratified that you remember that combinations given in the Jaimini Sutra, the person for odds of Jupiter and the Moon, the 5th from Karakamsha Lagna, and Karakamsha Lagna becomes Pisces here. It has Jupiter strong in its own sign, and the Moon goes to the 5th from there. Do you see any other additional factor that contributes to that authorship inclination? Any additional influence onto the 5th house?
A Moon together with 9th house authorship Mars from Karakamsha Lagna.
Yeah, that could add, but what we're looking for is the influence of the natural benefics on Karakamsha Lagna and or the 5th from there, right?
Mercury is aspecting from the 3rd house.
Okay, good, Garesh. So again, folks, those who are not that familiar with Jaimini, we're looking at Rashi Drishti here, where fixed signs and planets in fixed signs aspect onto movable signs, except for the one exactly next to them. So what I want you to see here is that the Karakamsha Lagna is Pisces. It has Jupiter in it. The 5th from there, Cancer, has the Moon. That Moon gets the additional aspect of Mercury. Right? So the idea is that authorship can come about when the natural benefics, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, and we include the Moon here, have an influence on the 1st or the 5th house from Karakamsha Lagna. There's some repetition of that pattern in the Navansha as well, not as strongly. But who are the two planets that from any standpoint are most indicative of authorship that we talked about?
Jupiter and Moon.
Jupiter and Mercury.
Jupiter and Mercury, and of course,
Jupiter, yeah.
And what do we? Well, of course, we notice clearly enough that Jupiter is very strong here as the Lord of the 5th house of authorship in the 5th house, right? It's not only one of the significators of authorship, but in this case, it's the Lord in its own sign of one of the main houses associated with authorship. But now, what about Mercury? Notice anything particularly special about Mercury?
Exchange of signs with Venus.
It's involved in an exchange. Anything else? Yes, Jay sees it. You see a planet at the very mid degrees of the fixed signs, you immediately want to think of our Gautama. So Mercury has two sources of strength there. It's involved in the exchange, and it's also Vargotama. And if you recall that article on the astrology of authorship, this is what we saw over and over again. We saw strong Jupiter, we saw strong and this is what we see here as well. All right. So, but when we go to evaluate the chart from the astrology of spirituality, which two planets are we most looking at first that I brought out in the article? From the Jaimini angle, okay? From the Jaimini angle, from just a straight approach here, not involving Jaimini yet. Which two grahas? Jnanakaraka and Mokshakaraka. Was the Jnanakaraka planet of higher wisdom, knowledge, so on and so forth?
Jupiter and Ketu?
Yes, Jupiter and Ketu, folks. Jupiter and Ketu, and we've already noted Jupiter's condition and strength and so on. What are the conditions under which Ketu becomes spiritualized? Anybody remember those?
Aspected by Jupiter.
And house, aspected by Jupiter.
Right. So, and don't forget the idea of moksha signs. Okay. What are the moksha signs?
4, 8, 12.
signs.
The Cancer and Scorpio and Pisces.
So of course the water signs and the water and the houses 4, 8, 12 are the signs and houses of moksha. And you see how they get emphasized here. Ketu gets very spiritualized, given the fact that it goes to the 9th house in a moksha sign with the 9th lord and aspect, and the aspect. And it was exactly in his Ketu Mahadasha, just shortly after, if you saw in 1949, is when he took sannyas, initiated sannyas.
I have a question, Mark. So does the conjunction of moon help, even if it was not the 9th lord, help with the spirituality, but the Ketu moon conjunction?
I got distracted because I had a message on my screen. Say that again, Jay. Say that again, Jay.
The question is, does the fact that Ketu is in conjunction with moon, and here moon happens to be the 9th lord, but no matter if moon and Ketu are conjunct, does it also in any form contribute to tendencies for spirituality?
Not by itself, right? If it falls in certain houses, yes, and here the additional influence of Jupiter is a very, very important factor. And so my answer would be no, okay? Not just by itself, okay? But I'm interested in what's behind the question, Jay. What was your line of thinking about that?
Line of thinking is, if moon and Ketu, let's say they're conjunct in the 5th house or 9th house, even when moon is not necessarily the 9th lord. And even if the houses are not the moksha houses, let's say if it's not Scorpio, Cancer, or Pisces.
My answer would be not necessarily. And then this becomes the moon afflicted by the Rahu-Ketu axis, right? And so not necessarily. But we saw a similar conjunction in the chart of Ramana Maharishi. But again, the moon was Bhargotama there. It was, in the 9th house with Ketu, right? So where do we see in the chart? This man obviously became a sannyasi, meaning he never married, never had a family. Where do we see the no marriage combination in this chart?
Venus, Saturn.
Well, of course, the Saturn conjunct Venus can, make it difficult. Well, it can delay marriage, sometimes deny marriage, depending on how it's configured here. But what makes it so particularly here?
J?
Exchange of 7th and 8th.
Yes. So Jay sees it exactly. It's the 7-8 exchange with the addition of Venus as the 7th lord now, not just Venus, Karaka, but as the 7th lord, with Saturn going to the 8th. But of course it was a voluntary thing. He became, but typically, if someone does become a sannyasi, they are brahmacharya, right? They don't marry, they don't engage in sexual relationships, or not if they're being a true brahmacharya. And so this combination is relevant here. But I highlighted also because I've emphasized that the influence of Saturn to the moon can bring sannyasi tendencies, but again, in the context of a particular chart, Venus-Saturn combinations can also create tendencies that way. Venus is the bogey, right? Venus is the planet of sensual pleasure, of worldly enjoyment, of comfort, the fine things of this world, luxuries, and so on and so forth. All of which someone who becomes sannyas renounces. That's part of what spiritual renunciation is all about. And so Saturn-Venus relationships, we saw in the chart of Pope Paul II, we saw that from the Jaimini standpoint, he had that Tapasvi Yoga with Venus conjunct Ketu, getting the Jaimini aspect of Saturn. Here we see the conjunction of Venus and Saturn. Okay. So anybody see any other yoga that's significant in this chart that I spoke about in the article? It's not necessarily yoga per se for it creates spiritual tendencies, but I spoke about it because it was relevant in some of the charts that I was doing an analysis of. Significant yoga in this chart that I've spoken about. Anyone?
Girish?
Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga with Sun, surrounded by Jupiter and Mercury.
Yes, absolutely. Good for you, Christian. And what makes this a particularly good Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga?
All planets are in strength. Sun is exalted. Jupiter is its own sign, also in the Navamsa. Mercury is Vargottama.
Right. So for those of you who may need a refresher about this, Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga occurs when the sun is exclusively, if it's going to be a pure Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga, when the sun is exclusively has benefics on either side of it. And of course, if it's in strength, it'll give more the kind of results that are given in the classics. It can be a combination that puts one in a high position, leadership position, which of course he certainly was. But what I find interesting here, if you read about his life, like so many of such individuals, his life was about seva, about service, first to the Sanatana Dharma. And the organizations that he founded were very, very involved in different types of social services and so on. And you see here that the Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga involves the 10th Lord, right? It's the 10th Lord in the 6th house involved in this Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga. Anything else that's particularly good about this yoga? We talked about the planets having strength, but do you see any other factor that then makes this a rather pure, unadulterated Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga?
Lena?
Maybe planets in Navamsha in good condition as well?
Well, there's sources of strength. It was continuing with Jupiter, who's both in its own sign Vargota, and Mercury, who's Vargotama. But what I want people to understand is that it has no blemish, folks. There's no influence of Rahu Ketu or Mars or Saturn, right? So your best Shubha Ubhyachari Yoga occurs when the sun is either in Aries and or Leo, because in the one it would be exalted and the other would be in its own sign. But then, also when the planets, the benefics on either side have sources of strength, which of course they do here, and additionally there's no blemish on the yoga, there's no influence of natural malefics. Right? So this is what you see here. Okay. Now, where can it be seen that this man just wasn't some, sadhu doing, sadhana in a cave in the Himalayas, although, he spent time with, teachers doing that, especially during the Ketu period. Where's the indication that this person would become a world famous guru? Mm-hmm.
I'll take Jay first and then Dina.
Can I?
Jay, go ahead.
Okay.
You have unmuted yourself.
Okay. Is it the Vargotama Jupiter?
Well, for a person to take on the identity of a guru, certainly, Jay, a strong Jupiter is going to help contribute to that, and it did in this case here. But what is the house of guruship?
9th house. Does he has a Gauri yoga? Because it's a little bit tricky. Yeah. Lagna Lord and Moon, 9th house Lord together. I was thinking that he has a Gauri yoga when 9th Lord is strong, Moon is strong, affected by strong Jupiter.
And he absolutely has Gauri yoga. And for those people
That makes
who
a
are,
noble person.
right, with those people who may be unfamiliar with that yoga, Moon, it's Gauri is Mother Divine, right? It's another name for Parvati, the consort of Lord Shiva. But just think Mother Divine, and it's defined by when the moon needs to be an angle and a trine in either in its own or exaltation sign, and it has to additionally get the aspect of a strong Jupiter, which is what we see here. But again, folks, this person was a famous guru. How could that be seen?
Vaibhav is saying the first lord and the 9th lord conjunct forming Raj Yoga aspected by Jupiter could be a reason.
It's not could be a reason, it's absolutely the reason. Right? This man has the first lord, and he was quite a philosopher too. And, he was when he left his guru, his mission was to, he thought, how Hinduism or the Sanatana Dharma was presented at the time was he thought it was horrible, really, in a lot of ways. And so he made it his mission in life to just basically be a traveling sannyasi who spoke on Advaita Vedanta concepts in particular, and drew huge audiences and became, very well known as a result of that. And it's the, who's the Lagna Lord? Always remember the idea of the pillar of life. Lagna Lord. What are the influences on the Lagna Lord? And where's the Lagna Lord fall? And here, it goes to the 9th house with the 9th Lord aspected by Jupiter, and Jupiter additionally aspects onto Lagna. So, here's the clear indication in his chart of his destiny to be a spiritual teacher.
And Mark, can we add that from Chandra Lagna, Moon, and in this case it is a strong Chandra Lagna, the 9th house of Guru is also really strong. We see Jupiter there. Yes, so from Chandra Lagna, 9th house is strong.
Absolutely, Ekaterina. Always keep in mind, karma is said to have, sort of 3 levels of intensity: fixed, firm, and flexible. And I'm asked by students of Jyotish, well, how can those karmas be differentiated in a chart? I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but when you see patterns or themes repeating from both the birth lagna and from Chandra lagna, this indicates a more, sort of fixed karma, for good or for ill. In this case, what Ekaterina is pointing out is that if you use Chandra lagna, think about how the chart becomes now, in which case that Mars becomes the 5th lord, right? Jupiter, Vargotama in its own sign, becomes the 9th lord in the 9th. So, absolutely, this is a combination that also indicates his destiny to become a very well-known spiritual teacher. Okay. Does anybody, so I think these are the main things that I wanted to highlight with regard to this chart, unless there's any questions about anything else that I've said thus far.
I think Girish has a point. So Girish?
I also see a Mukuta Yoga in the Navamsa involving Jupiter and Moon, and it's a very good one, like Jupiter in its own sign.
Yes, what Girish is referring to is that this yoga that I've highlighted in articles called Mukuta Yoga. Mukuta means the crown. It occurs when Jupiter falls in the 6th or 8th house from the moon in its own or exaltation sign. Right?
But moon sign, Girish, moon in the Navamsa is in the house of sun.
Right. I think Jupiter or Moon either has to be in its own sign or exaltation sign, correct, Mark?
No, moon doesn't have to be in any particular sign. Jupiter must be in its own or exaltation sign and fall in the 6th or the 8th house from the moon. Clear?
Okay.
Next we have Jay, followed by Lena. Jay?
I had a question for Mark. This person was a very powerful orator. Is that because his 2nd lord is very well placed in the 5th house?
Absolutely. And look at the second lord from the moon.
Exalted in the 10th house.
Shubha Ubacharya Yoga. Right? It's very clear, both from the birth lagna and from the moon. So the second from the birth lagna gets the additional aspect of another benefic. No, I wasn't really. I know he was quite the author. I wasn't aware, although I know he attracted huge audiences when he spoke. So yes, of course, he must have been, had real oratorical strength and ability, and I think that's pretty clear here by looking at both the second house, second lord from birth chart and from the moon. So I appreciate you bringing out that additional point.
Lena?
Can't hear you, Lina.
Here has Parvata yoga as well, mountain yoga, and even from Navamsha, not only from Lagna.
Talk about Parvati. Talk about Parvati yoga.
Lagna Lord dispositor is well placed in trine or angle in own or exaltation sign.
Wonderful. Yes, Parvati yoga. The ascendant here is very, very strong for a whole lot of different reasons. Even though the Lord itself is in its debilitation sign, but Parvati yoga is one of the reasons, and one of the things that obviously brings about the cancellation as well. I guess what I wanted to see by showing this chart, one of the things I wanted to see is that even a sort of a debilitated planet, or a planet in its debilitation sign, as the Atmakaraka, can give this great spirituality, right? But only, of course, under certain conditions. Anything else before we move on?
I think we're good to move on, Mark. No questions.
Okay. So, what I was showing in the article were the charts of great spiritual luminaries primarily. They're Atmakarakas. But before we leave this chart, remember I was also highlighting the PK, right? Planet with the 5th highest degrees, and relating this to one of the meanings of the 5th house, which is Purva Punya, right? Including the spiritual merit from previous lifetimes brought about by efforts towards spiritual development. And oftentimes, almost invariably actually, we saw of these great spiritual luminaries having some good and special condition as well. What do we see here? Planet with the 5th highest degrees, you can see the Karakas, the table of Karakas down here in the lower left. Who's the PK here?
Lena?
Mercury.
And what's its condition?
Vargotama.
Vargotama. Right? And in an exchange? Both? Very consistent with, at the end of that article, I summarized in a table the condition of all the AKs and the PKs of the charts of the spiritual luminaries that we looked at. And we saw how, again, almost invariably they were in a good and special condition, that is, having good sources of strength, which is what we see here. So I don't want to dwell on this, but I wanted to show some charts that where would be, you might say, the major contrast, the other extreme. Here we've been looking at Atmakarakas in very good condition, spirituality and great spiritual promise in the charts that I've shown you thus far. But then you have someone, and again, it's not that I want to sort of pass judgment on any souls, but certainly historically certain individuals have just caused tremendous suffering in the world. And of course, one of those was Adolf Hitler, who was probably responsible for the death of more people than anybody in history other than maybe somebody like Genghis Khan. And, of course, persecution of the Jews and the Holocaust and the death of millions of that. What do we see here in terms of the condition of his Atmakaraka? both in the birth chart and the Navamsha.
It's in the sign of a malefic Mars.
And
it's together with the Atmakaraka and Atmakaraka as well in the Rashi chart.
well, we're getting a little too Jaimini, and not everybody has that background, Garesh, but what I want people to see is that, first of all, it's retrograde in the sign of a malefic and so closely conjunct Mars, planet of violence, right? See the degrees. Venus at 24.23 and Mars at 24.4. What kind of condition of a planet does that create?
Graha Yuddha.
It's a Graha Yuddha, right? And in Jyotish, there's differing opinions about how you determine who wins the war or who loses the war. My opinion here, in my method of doing that, is clearly shows that Venus, who's both the Lagna Lord in this chart and also the Atmakaraka, gets this tremendously negative influence of Mars having been defeated in a planetary war. But then you see it in the Navamsha, which we always must do, and again apply Jaimini aspects. Jaimini aspect, what do we notice here?
Aspected by Rahu and Saturn, and it's also aspected by Saturn in the Rashi chart using planetary aspects.
Has planetary aspect, which we wouldn't necessarily apply here when we're just looking at the influences on the Atmakaraka, but we have two strong malefics, Sun and Mars, influencing in the birth chart in the sign of malefic and retrograde, but then in the Navamsha again goes into the sign of Mars with Mars, and now it gets the aspect of Rahu, because Rahu's in a movable sign aspecting onto the fixed sign, the Scorpio, and then also of a very strong Saturn, who's in its own sign aspecting onto the Atmakaraka Venus in the Navamsha there as well, without the modifying influence of any natural benefics either in the birth chart or in the Navamsha. This is the soul and darkness. Do you see the contrast? Are there questions about what I'm highlighting here? No? Okay.
So Mars, did you see, I'm seeing for the first time in Hitler's chart, has Gajakesari Yoga in both Navamsha and in its Rashi chart.
Right. Just an observation.
So it's basically a counter, right? It's making somebody very maybe infamous, Is that?
Well, yes. I mean, well, first of all, one of the reasons that he was able to rise to power is that he was, the Nazis put on these big spectacles, which were like huge theaters, right? And, of course, he had these oratorical abilities. And, one of the things that, that combination of the 10th Lord and the 3rd Lord, with the 3rd Lord strong in the 3rd, what are we seeing that combination be giving in the charts of a lot of, ones that I've used in articles? Anybody recall?
Prowess, aggression. Huh?
Well, certainly that, but I'm talking about the dramatic arts. I'm talking about an actor. I'm talking about performance, right? The spectacles that when he was rising to power and swaying the masses and so on and so forth, they were like these huge stage theaters, right? And this is one of his Gajakesari Yoga sort of relates to. Of course, it's under the influence of the Rahu-Ketu axis, but I'm going to be doing actually a long video series. It's going to start appearing on YouTube on Gajakesari Yoga. And you have to always understand that combination in the context of a chart as a whole. again from the Parashara angle, look at Venus here, the Lagna Lord. He was a frustrated artist. Hitler originally wanted to become an artist. He was rejected for, getting into art school. And after that, he became a soldier and then into politics. But, see Venus here, Lord of the First, retrograde in a sign of a malefic, planetary war by Mars, Saturn. And sort of the impulses towards, war and destruction and the rise to power as a substitute for, satisfying love relationships and all this. It's just sometime I'll do an astrobiography on Hitler's chart. It's very fascinating from my standpoint. I feel like I'm going off on a tangent here, so I'm going to move on. I just want to show you one more example here. I want to dwell on this. But
Mark,
most of you have probably heard of the...
Mark, as you bring it up,
yes?
Lena wants to ask one small question before we move on.
Sure, go ahead.
So about Jupiter and Moon in third house, that's such a strong combination. Also made him a preacher, a speaker, as well. Is it correct?
Well, it made him quite a performer. Okay.
Performer. Okay.
It made him quite a performer, and there's movie reels of Hitler, sort of basically practicing what is going to be his performance, prior to one of these big staged events, including his facial expressions, his gestures. It's almost like an actor rehearsing his act, right? But his strong oratorical abilities, had to do with the powerful Mars in the Raja yogas that it's involved in. With Mars being the second house of speech, right? And so, but anyway, we want to move on here in the interest of time. Most of you may be familiar with Charles Manson, the infamous Manson family, and the horrible crimes, the murders that were committed back in the August of 1969 that got so much publicity here in the U.S. Again, quite a dark figure in a certain way, although his disciples saw him as some sort of messiah. Very, very powerful, as you can see here, with all but one planet in Kent, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly enough, his aspirations originally is that he wanted to be a musician. There is Saraswati Yogi. But, what I want you to zero in on is the planet with the highest degree, is the Atmakaraka here.
Saturn.
Saturn.
Saturn. What are the influences on Saturn from a Jaimini standpoint?
Aspected by Mars, Rahu, and Moon.
It's with Rahu, with a malefic moon here, folks. The moon is malefic here. It's less than half bright, and it has the strongest of other. In particular, see its closeness in degrees to Rahu, with Rahu at 11.8 and the moon at 11.3. And note how the moon is, of course, both the Karaka of Mother and also the Lord of the Fourth House here. If you read about his, early childhood experiences, actually his mother, who was a prostitute, actually at one point sold him in a bar. He had a horrible sort of, mother-childhood type of experience that kind of, created sort of the individual, the personality that he was. But if you look at his Atmakaraka here, it's a natural malefic in its own sign, under the close influence of Rahu, a malefic moon, and from a Jaimini standpoint, of course, also Mars, who aspects from the fixed sign Leo onto the movable sign Saturn. So again, think about the Atmakarakas of the spiritual luminaries we've been looking at, their conditions, house placements, and so on and so forth. And in contrast, what we see in charts of souls, where you'd have to presume were rather in darkness, Charles Manson and Adolf Hitler. Okay, any questions about that? Because I don't want to dwell on this. I want to move back to spiritual charts.
It's not actually a question, but in both charts, in Hitler's chart and in Charles Manson, we see 4 planets in the 7th house. I mean, this is one of the Pravraja yoga, but in most cases, it's said that if these planets are burnt by the sun, this yoga will not apply, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And there is something else. In both charts had Srinata yoga. Here we see Venus, Mercury, and the word of the ninth Jupiter, and in Hitler's chart also there was Srinata yoga, but actually the planets had not so much strength. I mean, in Hitler's chart here.
So it's a very
we do ourselves in these yogas. Yeah.
Here it has all 3 yogas actually, Srinata, Shrikanta and Virinchi yoga.
Right, but within a particular concept. First of all, I want to comment on Ekaterina's remarks. First of all, that's exactly right, right? And you know, Hitler actually had some sort of, ascetic type of tendencies. If you read about his life history, and even spoke about these, and spoke about himself as being, something of an ascetic. But again, it's always sort of in the context of a particular chart that these yogas have to be understood and just seen. Again, in the interest of time, because there's certain things I want to cover, folks, I want to move on here. Now I want to show you the chart of someone, who's not famous, is not someone who's, you're going to recognize. And I only know him because he came to me for a chart consultation, but I know of his history very well through another good friend of mine who's a close friend of his. And I want you to see this here. Hold on. Just give me a moment here. I got to get rid of the name here. So zero in on the main point of the article first. And what do you notice?
We see 3 benefics in Lagna. And Jupiter and Moon are Sattva planets. I mean, this is a person who has a lot of virtues.
Well, first of all, good for you to see that all the planets related to the ascendant are what's called planets of Sattva, right? Primarily, it's Moon and Jupiter. Mercury is, but still, it's the Lagna Lorentz own sign here, in a natural benefic. So yes, that's one point. But I want people to zero in. Who's the Atmakaraka here? Who's the planet with the highest degrees?
Sun with Ketu in 12th house, and Sun is very strong in own house.
Yes, so here we have, again, a combination that we saw repeatedly in the charts of the spiritual luminaries from the article, where we've got a strong Atmakaraka. Here it's in the Sun, who's also the natural Atmakaraka, strong in its own sign, in the 12th house of Moksha, with the Moksha Ketu. But now then see Navamsha, what do you notice?
Together again in the Dharma sign.
Dharma sign, Dharma house, right? Now Atmakaraka is going to Sagittarius in the 9th house with Ketu and the mutual glance with Jupiter, the 9th lord here, and also the Jnanakaraka. Right? Now the only blemish on this picture back in the birth chart is that the Sun gets the Jaimini aspect from Saturn, right? But this is a rather extraordinary individual in the sense that he, throughout he's just a very committed, very dedicated practitioner of all aspects of yoga, does intense spiritual sadhana for hours daily, and has throughout his life. And interestingly enough, some of his practices relate to the sun. Some of his yoga sadhanas relate to practices related to the sun, which I find interesting here, given what we just saw about his sun. but again, you know, there are certain factors that, you know, create a spiritual context for this chart. What do we notice about Jupiter in the first house here as far as strength?
Digbala.
Directional strength.
Its directional strength. So there's a strong influence of Jupiter both on the Lagna and the Lagna Lord, right?
Also Mercury, right, Mark? Mercury also. Directional strength in the first house, exalted.
Absolutely. Just six degrees past its highest point, you know, exaltation. And of course, because the moon and Lagna are the same, right? Then, you know, whenever that's the case, the yogas are, again, more fixed in terms of their expression because they are applying both from the birth Lagna and from the moon. I've really never known of anyone, you know, except maybe the stories I hear of yogis in the Himalayas and caves and so forth, who has, you know, on a daily basis, you know, dedicated, you know, so much of their time of their life in doing, you know, sustained and intense tapas sadhana as this individual, and you know, the condition of his Atmakaraka is very revealing in terms of the spiritual planners here. Now him and his wife came to me, having been referred to me for a consultation because some Jyotish had given him some pretty dire predictions about his Saturn Mahadasha, which he was going to move into at the end of 2015. Okay? And I made some predictions that were the quite opposite of what other people were predicting that have since, you know, started to become true. What do we notice about his Saturn in terms of some type of combination in yoga I've written about in my articles?
It's the sixth lord in the Dushtana house. I mean, this was great Purusha exception, or no?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Great Parashara exception, because it is, first of all, the sixth lord, debilitated, likewise the sixth. And what's the other condition that we want to see, Ekaterina, for this yoga to apply?
Lagna should be strong. Lagna should be strong.
Lagna should be strong. Lagna Lord should be strong, which of course it's quite strong here, right?
Yes.
So, and you know, so I told him, and I knew, for example, that he was writing books. He was becoming an author, and his authorship was all about the esoteric aspects of yoga, subtle spiritual anatomy, kundalini, you know, samadhi, these experiences that he'd had while doing sadhana. And, you know, I told him that I thought he would write these books and that he would be quite successful with them, which is coming true. Notice that Saturn is the fifth lord of authorship, right? In the eighth house, having to do with these deep esoteric metaphysical matters, you know, the subtle energies, kundalini, yoga sadhana, and all these sorts of things, right? So in other words, what I explained to him and his wife, layman's terms, is that Saturn was going to give Raja Yoga specifically as an author of the topics. Do you see? Now, they looked a little skeptical based on what Jyotishis had told them. So I went back and I asked him about Saturn sub-periods within other you know, major periods, and much to his surprise, they saw that they actually, in many ways, turned out to be very good periods. So even if you don't see the application of that great Parashara exception, as Mr. Rao used to always refer to it, in terms of some of the results his Saturn can bring, then you might have a very you know, different view about what Saturn can bring in. Now, is it going to bring some, you know, maybe some other you know, potential for a serious disease at some point in the Saturn major period, which is of course 19 years long, and he would be in his very old age at some point here. Not unusual, yes, but it also gives Raja Yoga. And this is what, I wanted you to see, and of course, Ekaterina was able to see it. Good for her. Questions about that?
Mark, about the chart, he has second lord in the 11th house. A very good Dhan Yoga, right? So this person is pretty well to do.
I don't recall that he ever ran his Venus major period, but it's, yes, of course, the second lord in the 11th. He's been fortunate with properties. He bought some properties. You see how the strength of the, he bought some properties down in Costa Rica that, basically he became his wife managed the properties, and he did sadhana all day. Since he's, fairly fortunate in my answer. I'm not sure that's courtesy of Venus per se, although certainly Venus periods that he would have run would have activated that structure in his chart. But yes, it's a Dhan Yoga.
And we also
second lord and ninth lord in the, well, it's two things. Second lord and the ninth lord and the 11th disposited by moon, then goes to the first with two natural benefics. So yeah, pretty good financial karma indications there.
Mark, I have a question about the Sun and Ketu being in same degree. How usually we judge such a, when luminaries with Rahu or Ketu comes to same degree, what effect would have?
Well, every combination, you can look at it from different angles, Lena, right? Now, we all should know that it's, Rahu and Ketu are the points at which the Sun and the Moon are eclipsed, right? And from that standpoint, they are seen as being, enemies, mortal enemies to both the Sun and the Moon. And so from a mundane, you might say, conventional standpoint, to have, the Sun closely conjunct Ketu, or like my Moon, so closely conjunct Ketu in the 12th here, would not be considered a favorable thing from a mundane, conventional point of view. But from the spiritual point of view, it's a magnificent combination, right? And so, you have to consider these things from different angles. But I think your point is that isn't that an afflicted sun, from one standpoint, and not a good thing? And yes, the answer is yes. Okay?
Thank you.
So again, in the interest of time, because there's a couple, unless there's any burning questions about anything we've said thus far.
We're ready to move on now.
Okay. Now think back to the chart, first chart, or one of the charts I showed you about Swami Chinmayananda, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and have that chart in mind, and particularly the Atmakaraka as we look at this one. Which I think those of you who are in the Jaimini courses, we looked at this before. Zero in on the planet who is the Atmakaraka here. Who is it?
Mars.
Mars, right? And like Swami's, it's instabilitation sign, but of course at those degrees goes into Pisces in the Vamsha, right? But it's not with the moon, and doesn't therefore give the kind of reversal type of indications that it being with the moon did in the case of Swamiji's. Now there is a factor for cancellation of Mars's debility. Do you see it?
Moon in an angle in the 10th house.
Moon placed strongly in an angle, and also with Jupiter here forming a good case for yoga. So there's some underlining cancellation, but this is an example as well. Who's the well? Notice, of course, just like with Swamiji, Mars is with Ketu, Mokshakaraka, right? It's also with it's also with a natural benefic, who is the ninth lord of this chart. And of course, as I just recently mentioned, Mars then goes into Meena, Pisces, the sign most associated with Moksha in the Vamsha, although it has the influence of Rahu, Ketu, active, but with Ketu again, in influence of Ketu again, along with the natural Atmakaraka sun. Now, this is not someone of the spiritual stature of Swamiji, but he's also someone who took to spiritual life at a very young age, is an ordained Swami himself in the Kriya lineage, not a sannyas in the sense that, he's married, has a family, has a household, and all that sort of thing. But, since I think probably age 16, he also has been involved in doing a daily regular sadhana. Pursuing moksha is his highest value and highest goal in life. He has been someone who's taught all the different aspects of yoga, specifically the techniques of Kriya yoga brought to this country by Yogananda, and very, very spiritually oriented individual. What I'm wanting people to see is that, again, Atmakaraka in a moksha sign with Ketu, going to an even stronger moksha sign in the Navamsha as well. Okay? Good spiritual promise. Now, finally, we want to see the. Sorry?
Venus is also Putrakaraka here.
Right. So you have the Atmakaraka and Putrakaraka together, and what's Venus's source of strength, Girish?
It's in his own house in the Navamsha.
Right. And one thing I want to highlight here is this man's Saturn. You see, it's the fifth lord of Purva Punya, right? But from the moon, it's the ninth lord in the fifth house, right? And one of the things that gives a planet strength is when it falls in a number of good divisions in the Vargas, right? This is called Bala. You'll see that Saturn, first of all, it's Vargotama, exalted, but you'll see that it falls, if you looked at Dasavarga, those 10 divisions that are used to look at this, it falls in many, many good divisions. So see the man's Purva Punya. And he actually became a Swami. Recall that from the moon, Saturn is the ninth lord. He actually became a Swami, was ordained a Swami in Saturn Venus. Venus is the ninth lord from the birth chart. He took on the significance of a spiritual teacher, spiritual identity. And then again, look in the Navamsha and see how Saturn are with Venus, with Saturn again, Vargotama exalted in Venus in its own sign with Jupiter. So again, not some famous spiritual luminary, but a very highly oriented spiritual individual. Additionally, see the Jupiter aspects onto this Saturn. We're talking Parashari sign aspect. But before we run out of time here, there's one more chart that we want to see. From the standpoint of the astrology of spirituality. Now look at this chart from what we've been talking about. What strikes you?
4 planets in the 12th house in the sign of Dharma.
We have 4 planets in the 12th house in the sign of Dharma, but just any planets?
Atmakaraka and Putrakaraka as well, and Jnanakaraka Jupiter.
And what is the... Go ahead.
Fifth and the ninth.
Go ahead, Katrina.
Venus and Mercury are the 5th and the 9th wards of, these Dharma houses.
Yes. And see the Atmakaraka's condition. What is its condition? With Jupiter, also Vargotama. People see that? Again, if you go back and look at my table at the end of the article, you'll see how many times we saw these Atmakaraka, either in its own sign exalted or Vargotama, either in the 12th or the 9th. And this is exactly what we see here. Of course, because the Rahu Ketu axis is involved here, the Mokshakaraka Ketu that's not with it. But this is actually some similar configuration we saw in the case of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, right? who had a sun in Sagittarius in 12th, with Venus, which was also the 5th lord for Capricorn, but then, influence of Mokshakaraka Ketu, and these nodes are in are in the signs of benefics, and they're under the influence of so many benefics, right? So in terms of the kind of influence they are on the Atmakaraka, it changes the picture dramatically than what would normally be the case. Say if Rahu and Ketu were in the sign of malefics, for example, and under the influence of additional malefics. Is there any blemish on this combination that you can see that one should make note of? It's a beautiful spiritual promise. It's a beautiful combination, and this person is someone who's very committed to this spiritual pathway. Very early in the morning does their yoga sadhana regularly, very committed to it, and also teaches different aspects of yoga on a regular basis. So you can see the great spiritual promise, but what is a little bit attenuated in terms of all this combination of Sagittarius?
There is malefic blaming by Mars and Sun. Sun has a malefic, but still, yeah.
Right. So you've got some hemming going on here, but now also see the 5th house, 5th lord from the moon here. Okay. What happens now?
5th lord in the 5th house, Mars, malefic.
5th lord, well, fifth lord in its own 5th house in a moksha sign, and look at its degrees. What would be special about that from the standpoint of the astrology of spirituality?
Is it in
Sarpadrekana.
It's in a Sarpadrekana, right? It's in a Sarpadrekana. So a very interesting chart to consider in the light of the main thrust of the article, which was seeing certain soul qualities and certain soul inclinations towards spirituality based on the overall condition and position of the Atmakaraka planet.
Mark, there's a quick question from J. Raghavan. He says, can you elaborate on the Rahu Ketu placement in benefics?
Well, yes. I mean, how are Rahu and Ketu classified in Jyotish? They're classified as Chaya Grahas, which means shadowy planets. What does that mean? They have no substance of their own. You can't look up in the sky like you can with the other planets and the sun and the moon and see an actual entity, right? They're they're like energy vortexes that then take on the nature of whatever they're associated with. Now, of course, they're classified as innate in their innate nature. They're classified as natural malefics, but they change their indications quite strongly in terms of the kind of results they can give when they're following the signs of natural benefics, and additionally under the influence of natural benefics, and then without the blemish of natural malefics. So it's not a complete picture that way here, but see that Rahu and Ketu are following the benefic sign, and they're with all three natural benefics, two of which have sources of great strength. There is the hemming, right? But nonetheless, the type of how we view this Rahu and Ketu and the kind of influence it is on the Atmakaraka has to be tempered in relationship to what we see here. Is that clear, Jay?
Yes. So it looks like whenever Rahu and Ketu they are in this Jaimini, Sagittarius, or Virgo, Pisces, that is when they are both in benefic houses, and when they have all these other influences that we see. Like anywhere else, it will always be a malefic benefic combination, right? Like if Libra.
No. Well, you've got Rahu in Taurus, and you've got like Donald Trump at the moment, running his Rahu major period, in his 10th house conjunct his Lagna Lord, giving significant Raja Yoga, right? It's not a spiritual combination at all. but it's an example of the way in which, you know, Rahu is in its, you know, exalted sign and the sign of a benefic, you know, is capable of giving a tremendous Raja Yoga. If you consider that to be you know, a favorable. Okay, so now there's one question that was sent to me that I want to address. You know, and it concerned the one type of sannyasa yoga involving the position of the moon in both the Drekana and the Navamsha. You know, I was quoting from, and I'm going to quote again here, from that chapter on Pravaraj yogas or sannyasa yogas, and where it says that if the moon be in the Drekana of Saturn and also in the Navamsha of Saturn or Mars and aspected by Saturn, the native will be an ascetic of the type signified by Saturn. It's kind of a confusing statement, actually, and you know, if I was better at Sanskrit at some point, I'll go back and kind of see it in the original Sanskrit and see if I think the translator got it right. But I guess what I want to share about this is that when I was first, you know, told about these yogas, it didn't come from seeing it in Parashara, it come from Mr. Rao. And the reason I became aware of it, because in my very first consultation I ever had with Mr. Rao, he surprised me by, you know, not talking about what he saw in my birth chart, but he started by talking about things that he saw in my Navamsha, which, you know, I'm going to share with you here. And the yoga, as he described it, is it was defined by when the moon in the Navamsha is in the sign of Mars aspected by Saturn, or alternatively, when the moon is in the sign of Saturn aspected by Mars. This is how he you know, defined this particular yoga and described it as, you know, potentially a sannyasi yoga. Now, you can have these yogas in your chart and not necessarily become a sannyasi, but you can, you know, you can have certain tendencies that way. And, you know, so one of the first things he talked to, you can see I have the moon in the 9th house with Ketu aspected by Saturn. Then there's an exchange between the moon and Mars here. And he rather astonished me, in his usual sort of way, when he told me that in my Mars-Moon period, I had a very powerful spiritual experience, which he was absolutely right. The most powerful inner spiritual experience I've had in my life took place in the major period of the Moon, 7th period of Mars, which is a part of this configuration of an exchange between the 9th and the 5th lords in the Navamsha, with Moon conjunct Ketu, and then involved in this you know, type of a sannyasi, you know, type yoga here. So, you know, to the person who asked that question, he really didn't bring in this idea of the Drekana as it's brought out in the passage in the Parashara, and I really not researched it that much. When I go to see these yogas myself, as I highlighted them in the chart of yoga, in the Saraswati and in Ramakrishna Paramahamsa in the article that I sent out, I'm focusing more on the moon's placement in the Navamsha, the sign of Mars aspected by Saturn, or the converse. Okay? So this is my response to the question. Okay? So we've come to the end of our time. I'll just, you know, allow a little bit more time here if there are additional questions that people have about anything we've talked about or any charts we've looked about or anything at all that was in the articles.
Yes, I have one question. I was trying to apply one yoga, I think in first chart, and I failed. I did mistake as well. But it's saying if one of sannyasi yogas, if the dispositor of the moon is weak and only aspected by Saturn, the native will embrace the religious precepts duly signified by Saturn. That's as I do understand, if dispositor of weak moon is aspected by Saturn, I believe that in the chart, then is some also directing to some sannyasi, if it's supported in general, you know, all charts, some religious aspect. It's kind of confusing for me. Thank you.
And I'm sorry to say that in the way you asked the question, it's kind of confusing to me too. But, you know, I guess what I would say about that is that, you know, under the right circumstances, all of those the combinations given in that chapter on sannyasa yogas and parashara will be effective. But usually there's more to it than that. In other words, those combinations have to appear within a particular context. Usually just by themselves, as witnessed by my Navamsha here. I thought about becoming a priest when I was growing up a Catholic, but I certainly didn't become one. I didn't become a spiritual renunciant. Didn't take on a religious order or vow or anything. So I can't really respond to that other than just to say that, Lena. Okay. Any other questions here before I make some final comments and we conclude?
No, Mark, we have nothing on the screen.
Okay. So, folks, tomorrow is May 1, and so you'll be receiving the next article in the subscription program. You'll see that, and then, typically the webinar associated will be the last weekend of the month, but I'm going to announce the exact day more ahead of time this time so that people can plan ahead if they need to, but then, registration link will go out, say about a week before. And also stay tuned. There'll be some announcements I'll be making about some other online courses and programs that I'm going to be rolling out here, within the month of May. Should people be interested in that. Other than that, appreciate everyone's participation. My thanks to Arun, as usual, for dedicating his time and energy to playing the role of moderator and administrator, and to our panelists who participated well here. So we'll end as we usually end with a final prayer. Ohum masato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotir gamaya, mrityor ma amritam gamaya, sarvesham swasti bhavatu, sarvesham shanti bhavatu, sarvesham mangalam bhavatu, sarvesham purnam bhavatu, loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.